Gold digger marries my dad 2 years before his death, and now she expects to take over his estate, but she has no clue who really owns it. All right, so here's the deal. My dad's going into hospice next week, and it's been a mess for a while now. I mean, we all knew it was coming, but it doesn't make it any easier, right? Thing is, the house he's living in with his wife Sandy and her two daughters, Tina and Beth, isn't even his house. It's mine. I bought it years ago, but you wouldn't know that by the way they've been acting. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me rewind a bit. About 7 years ago, things got rough for my dad after my mom passed away. They'd been together for over 30 years, and when she died, it wrecked him. I mean, it was hard for all of us. But my dad? He fell apart. He lost his job a few months later, couldn't keep up with the rent on their apartment, and got evicted. It was like everything just crumbled at once, and he didn't have anyone else to turn to. I was all he had. So being the only kid in a position to help, I bought him a house. Nothing crazy, just a small place in a quiet older neighborhood. It wasn't fancy, but it was safe, and more importantly, it gave him a roof over his head when he really needed it. He had his dog Charlie too, and honestly, Charlie was like his last connection to my mom. That dog was family to us, you know? It made the whole situation a little easier for him. For the first few years, things were good. Dad was healing, slowly, and the house became his little sanctuary. He got back on his feet as much as anyone could after something like that, and Charlie was always there by his side, keeping him company. I'd visit every weekend, and it became our routine. Charlie would wag his tail like crazy whenever I showed up, and we'd hang out in the backyard, grilling burgers, catching up, just trying to enjoy life again after everything that had happened. Then Sandy came into the picture. They met through some mutual friends, and before I knew it, they were married. I wasn't against it or anything. I mean, I was happy for my dad if this was what he needed. And Sandy seemed all right at first, you know? She was polite, always had a smile, and she seemed like she genuinely cared about my dad. So, when he said she was moving in, I didn't have a problem with it. It's his life, after all, even if it's technically my house. As long as he was happy, that's all that mattered. But here's where things started getting a little weird. First, it was just Sandy moving in. Fine. Then, out of nowhere, her daughter Tina shows up with all her stuff. Like she's moving in too. Now, Tina's in her late 20s, a grown adult. So it's not like she's some kid who needs a place to crash for a weekend. No, she's there to stay. I didn't say anything because, again, it's my dad's life and I wanted to respect that. But still, it was a little strange, right? A few months go by and I start noticing things every time I visit. There's more of Sandy's stuff everywhere. The house, which used to feel like my dad's place, now felt like it was more hers. Whatever, I told myself. Dad's happy, let it be. But then, just when I thought it couldn't get more crowded, Beth, the younger daughter, moves in. Now it's a full house. Sandy, Tina, Beth, and my dad, all under one roof. And you can imagine how that went. At first, I tried to let it go. I mean, yeah, it was weird seeing my dad's home being slowly taken over by Sandy and her daughters, but what could I do? I'm not going to tell my dad how to live his life. But things started getting worse. The vibe in the house shifted. Suddenly, my dad's opinion didn't seem to matter much anymore. Everything was about what Sandy and her daughters wanted. Things were already going downhill with Sandy and her daughters slowly taking over my dad's house. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get more annoying, we had the whole mess with Charlie. Let me explain something about Charlie. This dog wasn't just a pet. Charlie was family. My mom loved that dog like he was her baby, and after she passed away, Charlie became my dad's emotional support. It was like Charlie was the one thing keeping him grounded after everything that happened. I know some people don't get that, but if you've ever had a dog, you know what I mean. So, you can imagine how much it pissed me off when Beth, Sandy's youngest daughter, started complaining about Charlie. Like, really? Charlie was old, harmless, and spent 90% of his day either sleeping or chasing his own tail when he wasn't too tired. But one day, out of the blue, Beth comes up with this whole thing about how Charlie makes her uncomfortable. She said she didn't feel safe with him around. Now, I'm not one to dismiss people's fears, but come on. This was Charlie, not some rabid wolf. The guy was 12 years old, could barely make it up the stairs without needing a break, and was about as dangerous as a pillow. I didn't take it seriously at first. Thought maybe she was just being dramatic. But Sandy, of course, jumped in to back her up, making a whole big deal out of it. She started saying that maybe it was time for Charlie to find a new home, like he was some unwanted furniture that needed to be thrown out. That was my breaking point. I could see the stress it was putting on my dad. He wasn't just being asked to give up a dog. He was being asked to give up the last real connection he had to my mom. It broke my heart to see it. But what could I do? I wasn't living there, and Sandy had pretty much taken over the decision-making in the house. I could tell my dad didn't want to get rid of Charlie, but he was tired. He was dealing with his own health issues, and I guess he didn't have the energy to fight back anymore. So, yeah, I stepped in. I told my dad straight up that Charlie could come live with me. I wasn't going to let Sandy or her daughters bully him into giving up that dog. My dad was relieved, but I could tell it still hurt him. I mean, he didn't want to give up Charlie, but he knew it was the only way to stop the constant arguing in the house. Sandy acted like she was doing him some huge favor by letting me take Charlie in, but I knew better. It wasn't about Charlie. It was about control. She and her daughters wanted to be the ones calling all the shots, and Charlie was just another way to push my dad out of the decision-making process in his own home. From that day on, I started bringing Charlie with me every time I visited, and every single time, it was like I was bringing some kind of dangerous animal into the house. Tina and Beth would literally act like Charlie was going to maul them any second. The first time I showed up with him after taking him home, Beth actually screamed when she saw him, like she hadn't lived with this dog for the past few years. Sandy tried to play it off, but you could see her rolling her eyes every time I walked in the door with Charlie trotting behind me. It was ridiculous. Charlie would come in, wagging his little tail, barely noticing them, and all they could do was complain about how scary he was. I'd sit with my dad in the backyard, just like we always did, while Charlie lay there in the grass, not bothering anyone. And yet, every time Beth or Tina would peek out the window, give us this disgusted look, and run off like they were avoiding some kind of attack dog. Honestly, I think they just hated that Charlie was still around because it was a reminder that this was my dad's house, not theirs. Charlie was part of my dad's life, part of my mom's life. And no matter how much they tried to take over, Charlie was a constant reminder that they hadn't completely pushed my dad out yet. But then, one day, Sandy finally said what I knew had been coming. She asked me not to bring Charlie around anymore. I was fuming. Why? I asked. Charlie's not doing anything. He just sits there. She tried to sugarcoat it, saying how Beth still felt uncomfortable and how it was just better if Charlie didn't come over anymore. I could see right through it. This wasn't about Charlie at all. This was about power. She and her daughters had been slowly chipping away at everything that was important to my dad, and now they wanted to get rid of the last thing that connected him to his old life. I was livid, but I didn't want to make things harder for my dad. He was already sick, and the last thing I wanted was to stress him out more. So, I told Sandy straight to her face, Charlie stays. He's not hurting anyone, and if you don't like it, then don't come outside when I visit. She didn't like that, not one bit. But I wasn't backing down. I could tell she wanted to push harder, but I wasn't giving her the chance. From then on, every time I visited, Charlie came with me, and I didn't care what they thought. My dad deserved that much, at least. The tension in the house got worse after that. It was like Sandy and her daughters were just waiting for my dad to be out of the picture so they could fully take over. I could see it in the way they treated him, like he was just some old man taking up space. But as long as Charlie and I were around, they couldn't quite get rid of him entirely. And now, with my dad going into hospice, I can already see the writing on the wall. They think they're going to get the house, that everything's going to belong to them once he's gone. But they're in for a surprise. This is still my house, and Charlie, he's going to outlast all of them. So with my dad going into hospice soon, I knew time was running out to say goodbye properly. It was something I dreaded, but I couldn't put it off anymore. He wasn't doing well, and I needed to see him, especially since I'd been taking care of Charlie ever since Sandy and her daughters basically forced him out. I wanted to bring Charlie to see my dad one last time, let them have their moment before everything went downhill. When I showed up at the house, Sandy, Tina, and Beth were already there. The second I walked in with Charlie by my side, I could feel the tension in the room. You know when you walk into a place and everyone just stops what they're doing? Yeah, it was like that. The vibe was off, but I didn't care. I was there for my dad, not for them. Tina was the first to say something. She looked at Charlie, wrinkled her nose, and said, "Oh great, he brought that stupid dog again." She wasn't even trying to hide the attitude. She acted like Charlie was some kind of wild animal, but the truth is, Charlie was so old at this point, he barely moved unless you coaxed him with a treat or something. But there she was, acting all dramatic, like the dog was going to destroy the house. I took a deep breath and ignored her. I wasn't about to start a fight right then, even though I could feel my blood boiling. I just said, "I'm here to see Dad," and headed straight for his room. I could hear Sandy say something to Beth under her breath as I passed, but I didn't catch all of it. Probably some passive-aggressive comment about me or the dog, but whatever. I didn't have the energy to deal with them. When I got to my dad's room, he was lying in bed, looking frail but still awake. His face lit up when he saw me, and when Charlie trotted in behind me, wagging his tail like crazy, my dad smiled for the first time in weeks. It hit me right then how much my dad had missed Charlie. Charlie immediately jumped up on the bed, which honestly was a struggle for him with how old he was, but he made it. He curled up next to my dad, like they hadn't missed a beat. My dad reached over and scratched behind Charlie's ears, just like he used to. For a few minutes, it was like things were normal again, and I could see how much peace it brought my dad to have Charlie there. We didn't talk much at first. It was one of those moments where words aren't really needed, you know? I just sat there with him, Charlie laying between us, and we stayed like that for a bit. I could tell my dad was weaker than the last time I'd seen him, and it hurt to see him like that, but there was also a kind of relief. At least for those few minutes, he looked happy again. After a while, my dad spoke up. "I've missed this old guy," he said, his voice a little shaky but still carrying that familiar warmth. "It's good to see him again." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak without choking up. I didn't want to show how emotional I was getting, so I just reached over and patted Charlie on the head. We talked for a bit, about simple things. Memories, stories about Charlie, old family moments from when Mom was still around. It felt good, but it was also bittersweet. The whole time I kept thinking about how this might be the last time I'd ever see my dad like this, awake and aware. It's a hard thing to wrap your head around, even when you know it's coming. And then, of course, Sandy had to ruin it. I was getting ready to leave when she walked in, not even bothering to knock. She glanced at Charlie curled up on the bed next to my dad and immediately looked annoyed. "I thought I asked you not to bring that dog here," she said, crossing her arms and glaring at me like I'd committed some huge crime. I felt the anger bubbling up again, but I stayed calm. "Charlie isn't hurting anyone," I said, keeping my voice steady. "He's here to say goodbye to Dad. You've got a problem with that?" Beth, who had followed her mom into the room, piped up from behind her. "Good riddance," she muttered, loud enough for me to hear. "I'm glad we won't have to deal with him after this." That was it. I'd had enough. I stood up trying to keep my cool, but it wasn't easy. "You know what? I don't care what you think about Charlie. He's family, and he's staying here as long as I'm here. If you don't like it, tough." Sandy looked like she wanted to argue, but my dad cut her off. "It's fine," he said quietly. "Let them be." His voice was soft but firm, and Sandy didn't push it any further. I stayed a little while longer after that, mostly to make sure my dad and Charlie had enough time together. But eventually I had to leave. I knew it was probably the last time I'd bring Charlie over, and I wanted it to end on a good note. As I was walking out, Tina was sitting in the living room, scrolling through her phone, and she barely looked up when I passed. But just as I was about to reach the door, she said, "I can't wait until we never have to see that dog again." I stopped in my tracks, turned around, and just stared at her for a second, trying to decide if I was really going to engage. But then I just said, "You won't have to," and walked out. I didn't need to give them any more of my time. On the drive home, I kept thinking about how wrong this all felt. It wasn't just about Charlie. It was about everything. How my dad's house had become something else entirely. How Sandy and her daughters had taken over. How they didn't even seem to care about my dad's condition. It was like they were just waiting for him to die so they could get on with their lives. But the joke's on them. This house isn't theirs, and when the time comes, they're going to find that out the hard way. Update 1. After that last visit with my dad, I knew something had to change. I couldn't keep tiptoeing around Sandy and her daughters, letting them act like they owned the place while I just stood by. My dad wasn't getting any better, and it was only a matter of time before he was gone. Once that happened, I knew Sandy and her daughters would expect to stay in the house indefinitely, just living there rent-free like they'd been doing for years. I wasn't going to let that happen. But instead of dropping the big bomb on them about the house being mine, I decided to take it step by step. First, I needed to see how they'd react to the idea of paying rent. Maybe, just maybe, they'd show some sign of responsibility and agree to it. But I wasn't holding my breath. So a few days after that emotional visit with my dad, I went back to the house. I walked in, and as usual, Sandy, Tina, and Beth were all hanging out in the living room like they didn't have a care in the world. They were watching some reality show on TV, laughing at something, and it honestly made me mad. My dad was in hospice, and here they were, acting like everything was fine. I took a deep breath and walked into the room. Tina glanced up at me, barely acknowledging that I was there, while Sandy paused the TV, clearly annoyed that I was interrupting their precious showtime. "Can we talk for a minute?" I asked, trying to keep my tone calm. I didn't want to start this off on the wrong foot, even though I was already feeling frustrated. Sandy raised an eyebrow. "About what?" "About what's going to happen after my dad passes," I said. I could feel the tension in the room rise instantly. The smiles and laughter disappeared, and suddenly, all eyes were on me. Good. They needed to hear this. I've been thinking about it, and we need to talk about the house, I continued. Specifically, about rent. The word rent hung in the air like a grenade waiting to explode. Beth let out an incredulous laugh. Rent? What are you talking about? I didn't let her get to me. Once Dad passes, things are going to change. If you want to keep living here, you're going to have to start paying rent. I've already talked to a lawyer, and we've worked out a fair amount based on the market value of the house. Beth looked at me like I just insulted her entire existence. Tina sat up straight, ready to jump in with some snarky comment, but Sandy beat her to it. Wait a minute, Sandy said, narrowing her eyes. Why would we need to pay rent? James wanted us to stay here. I nodded, keeping my voice even. I get that, but I've been covering the costs of this house for years, and that can't continue after he's gone. You've had a good deal here for a long time, but things are going to have to change. Either you start paying rent, or you'll need to find somewhere else to live. The room went dead quiet. I could see the wheels turning in Sandy's head as she tried to process what I was saying. Tina and Beth looked completely blindsided, like the idea of paying rent had never crossed their minds. Of course it hadn't. Why would it, when they'd been living there for free all this time? Finally, Sandy spoke up, her voice sharp. This is James's house. He wanted us to stay here. You're not going to charge us rent after everything we've done for him. I clenched my jaw, trying to keep my cool. Look, I'm not trying to make this difficult, but the reality is someone has to take care of the expenses, and it's not going to be me anymore. I've already covered everything up until now, but I can't keep doing that after Dad's gone. You either pay rent or you move out. Those are your options. Tina finally jumped in, her face red with anger. You're unbelievable! We've been living here for years, and now you're trying to make money off us? What kind of person does that to family? I sighed, feeling the frustration building. I'm not trying to make money off anyone. I'm trying to make sure things are handled fairly. I've given you plenty of time, and I'm giving you more time now. 3 months after Dad passes, 3 months to figure out what you're going to do. That's more than fair. Beth crossed her arms, glaring at me. So what? You're just going to throw us out if we don't pay? I don't want it to come to that, I said, meeting her glare. But yeah, if you're not willing to pay rent, then you'll have to leave. I can't keep covering the costs for you. Sandy stood up then, trying to play the victim card. I can't believe you do this to us after everything we've done for James. Everything we've done for this family. You're just going to kick us out like we're nothing? I shook my head. I'm not kicking you out. I'm giving you options. But like I said, things are going to change, and you need to be ready for that. I'm giving you 3 months to figure it out. That's more than generous. I could see Tina getting ready to say something else, but I was done with the conversation. I'd said what I needed to say, and I wasn't going to stand there and argue with them all day. So before they could pile on more complaints or guilt trips, I turned and headed for the door. As I left the house, I could still hear them talking, probably trying to figure out how to get around this, how to keep living there for free. But I wasn't going to budge. I'd given them their choices, pay rent or move out, and in 3 months they were going to have to face reality. They just didn't know yet that the house wasn't even my dad's to give them. Update 2. It happened faster than I thought. One day my dad was still hanging on, and the next, he was gone. Even though I knew it was coming, it still hit me like a ton of bricks. Watching him slip away like that wasn't easy, but at least I knew he was at peace now. It was over for him, and the pain he had been living with for so long was finally gone. But after the funeral, I had to deal with the aftermath. And no surprise, Sandy and her daughters, Tina and Beth, were acting like nothing had changed. It was almost as if they'd been waiting for this moment, expecting everything to fall into place for them. Like they were ready to take over now that my dad wasn't around. But they had no idea what was coming. I gave it a few days after the funeral to let things settle down, but I wasn't going to wait too long. The sooner I dealt with this, the better. They were probably expecting to stay in that house forever, free of charge, but I had other plans. So, I went over to the house. When I got there, Sandy was in the living room with Tina and Beth, sitting around like they owned the place. They were laughing about something on the TV, totally ignoring the fact that my dad had just passed. There was no grief, no sadness, just them living their lives like nothing had happened. I stood in the doorway for a second, just watching them. It was surreal, honestly. How could they be so unaffected by everything? I mean, my dad had just died, and here they were, acting like it was just another day. Finally, I cleared my throat and walked in. Sandy turned to look at me, but didn't say anything. Neither did Tina or Beth. They just sat there, waiting. I guess they thought I was there to talk about funeral arrangements or whatever. I took a deep breath. We need to talk about the house. Sandy frowned, not understanding. What do you mean? We've already talked about this. We're staying here just like James wanted. And there it was. The entitlement I had been expecting. I could feel my anger rising, but I kept my cool. I wasn't going to let them get to me. No, I said, shaking my head. We haven't talked about this. You think you're staying here, but the truth is you're not. This house isn't my dad's. It's mine. I bought it for him after my mom died, and now that he's gone, it goes back to me. The room went dead silent. I could see the shock on Sandy's face, like she had no idea what I was talking about. She blinked a few times before finally saying, "What are you talking about? James never told me that. This is our home." I almost laughed. Yeah, well, he didn't need to tell you. This house was never his to give. I bought it for him to live in after he lost his apartment, but it's been in my name the whole time. And now that he's gone, it's time for you to go too. Tina stood up, looking furious. You can't just kick us out. We've been living here for years. This is our home now. I turned to her, keeping my voice steady. No, it's not your home. You've been living here for free, and I've let it slide because of my dad. But now that he's gone, that stops. You either start paying rent or you leave. You have 3 months to figure it out. They were all stunned. Sandy looked like she was about to cry, but she quickly turned that into anger. You can't do this to us. James wanted us to stay here. I'm sorry, I said, although I didn't really mean it. But that's not how this works. Legally, this is my house, and I'm not going to let you stay here without paying rent. You've been taking advantage of my dad for years, and I'm done letting it happen. Sandy tried to argue, but I wasn't listening anymore. I could feel the tension building in the room, but I wasn't backing down. This was my house, and I had every right to do what I was doing. I've already spoken to my lawyer, I added, pulling out the paperwork to prove it. If you don't believe me, here it is in black and white. I own this house, not you, and not my dad. I've given you 3 months to figure out what you're going to do. After that, if you're not out, I'll have no problem evicting you. Beth was sitting on the couch, staring at the paperwork with her mouth hanging open. This can't be happening, she muttered, looking at Sandy for some kind of reassurance. But Sandy had nothing. She knew it was over. I could see it in her eyes. She had been banking on this house, thinking they could just stay here forever, rent-free. But now, reality was hitting them hard. You've got to be kidding me, Tina said, pacing around the room. After everything we've done for James, you're just throwing us out? I almost laughed again. Everything you've done? You mean disrespecting him, pushing him to get rid of Charlie, and treating him like a guest in his own home? Yeah, real generous of you. They all started talking at once, trying to defend themselves. But I wasn't listening anymore. I'd had enough of their excuses, their entitlement, their complete lack of respect. My dad deserved better, and I wasn't going to let them keep living in this house like they owned it. I've said what I came to say, I told them, turning toward the door. You've got 3 months. After that, we'll see what happens. As I left, I could hear them still arguing behind me, trying to figure out what they were going to do. But that wasn't my problem anymore. They had spent years living off my dad, off of me, and now it was time for them to deal with the consequences. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders as I walked out of the house. It wasn't going to be easy, but I knew I was doing the right thing. I had let them take advantage of the situation for too long, and now it was time to take back what was mine. This house wasn't theirs. It never was. And soon enough, they were going to be out of my life for good. Update 3. So after I told Sandy and her daughters they had to move out or start paying rent, I figured that was the end of it. I mean, what else could they do? I had the law on my side, all the paperwork showing I owned the house, and I gave them more than enough time to figure things out. 3 months was fair, right? Well, apparently Sandy didn't think so. Because, get this, she tried to sue me. Yeah, Sandy actually went to a lawyer and filed a lawsuit, claiming she had a right to stay in the house because she was my dad's wife and had been promised it after he died. When I first heard about it, I almost laughed. I got served the paperwork one afternoon while I was at work, and my first reaction was, you've got to be kidding me. I mean, what was she thinking? She knew I owned the house. I'd shown her the documents, spoken to her calmly about it, and even gave her more time than most people would to get her life sorted out. But no, apparently that wasn't enough. She decided to take it to court, thinking she'd somehow win. Now, I've never been a fan of going to court. The whole process is just a headache. But at the same time, I wasn't worried. I had my lawyer lined up and ready to go. And I knew we had everything we needed to shut this thing down before it even got off the ground. The first thing I did was call my lawyer. He was calm about it, probably because this kind of thing happens more often than you'd think. He looked over the paperwork Sandy filed and was like, yeah, this isn't going to go anywhere. They don't have a leg to stand on. But even knowing that, I was still annoyed that I had to deal with this at all. I mean, come on. They had already been living in my house rent-free for years. What more did they want? Anyway, the whole thing dragged on for a couple of months. Sandy was making all these claims about how she was promised the house by my dad, even though there was zero paperwork or proof to back that up. She tried to play the grieving widow card, acting like I was this evil guy kicking her out of her home. But the reality was, she had no legal claim to the house at all. During the hearings, I had to sit there and listen to her lawyer try to spin this story about how Sandy and my dad had plans to leave the house to her after he passed and how she had put so much into making it a home for them. Yeah, sure. What she left out was how she and her daughters had taken over the place, treated my dad like a guest in his own house, and tried to get rid of Charlie, my dad's dog. But of course, none of that came up. I kept my cool through most of it. I knew the judge wasn't buying it, and my lawyer was doing a great job shutting down every claim Sandy's lawyer made. We had all the documents to prove that the house was mine, title deeds, bank records, everything. So every time they tried to bring up some promise my dad supposedly made, we hit them with cold, hard facts. One of the more ridiculous moments was when Sandy tried to claim she had made improvements to the house and that she deserved some kind of compensation for that. Improvements? The house was in the same condition it had been in when I bought it. If anything, it was in worse shape because they hadn't taken care of it properly. My lawyer pointed that out, and the judge shut that argument down real fast. And, to make it even better, Sandy's daughters, Tina and Beth, had the nerve to show up in court and act like they were victims in all of this. Tina tried to talk about how they had been living there for years and how it was their home, and I just sat there thinking, you've been living there for free, and now you're trying to act like I owe you something? I wanted to say something, but my lawyer gave me that look that said, let it go, so I stayed quiet. It didn't take long for the judge to make a decision. He basically said what we all knew from the start. Sandy had no claim to the house. There was no will, no written agreement, nothing that showed my dad had ever promised the house to her. And since the house was legally mine, Sandy and her daughters were going to have to move out. I wish I could say I was surprised, but honestly I wasn't. I knew this was how it would end. The whole lawsuit was just a desperate attempt to hold on to something they never had a right to in the first place. The judge gave them a final deadline, 2 weeks to move out, or the eviction process would start. When we walked out of the courtroom, Sandy wouldn't even look at me. She just stormed off with Tina and Beth trailing behind her, all of them acting like I had done something horrible to them. But I didn't feel bad. I'd given them more time and more chances than they deserved, and they still tried to screw me over. In the end, they didn't have much of a choice. After the court ruling, they packed up and left. I didn't hear from them again after that. No more phone calls, no more texts, nothing. It was like they disappeared, and honestly, I was relieved. The whole thing had been a nightmare, but now it was over. The house was finally mine again, and I didn't have to deal with their drama anymore. Sure, it had been a long, exhausting process, but I came out on top. And Sandy, well, she lost. It didn't matter what promises she thought my dad made. In the end, the law was the law, and she couldn't change that. So yeah, she tried to sue me, and she lost. Now the house is mine, and they're gone for good. And honestly, that's all I ever wanted.
My name is Isabella, and I'm 28 years old. Like many women my age, I have a job, a family, and a husband, Richard, who is 2 years older than me. We've been married for almost a year, but it hasn't been the smooth journey I once dreamed of. Let me take you back to where it all began. Richard and I met at a party. I was invited by a colleague and honestly wasn't expecting much. It was one of those events where everyone is loud, confident, and trying to impress. Richard was different, though. Amidst all the noise, he stood out as calm, quiet, and incredibly kind. He wasn't like the other men who tried too hard or came off as sleazy. His conversations were thoughtful and genuine. I remember him telling me, "My family is really close. We spend a lot of time together." He didn't have to boast about his accomplishments like everyone else. He was just real. I gave him my number, and from that moment, we started seeing each other more often. We clicked almost instantly. Richard had lived with his parents up until that point, while I had been living alone since college. Because he didn't pay rent, his finances were in better shape than mine, and he loved to travel, something I couldn't afford as often as he could. Despite our differences, we enjoyed spending time together, and soon we started dating seriously. Before I knew it, we were engaged and planning a life together. Everything seemed perfect. We got married, and I thought this was it. My happily ever after. But as soon as we moved into our apartment, things changed. Richard was thrilled about moving out of his parents' home and starting fresh in our new place. I was too, but there was one thing I hadn't expected. His parents were never far behind. One night, just a few weeks into our marriage, Richard casually said, "Hey, I'm inviting Mom and Dad over this weekend." I thought it was a sweet gesture. After all, it's normal for family to visit. But then he added, "Actually, they'll be coming over every weekend from now on." Every weekend? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I tried to stay calm, assuming it was a temporary thing, but it quickly became clear that this was our new reality. Richard's parents lived only a short drive away, and they took full advantage of that fact. They would arrive Friday night and stay until late Sunday, every single weekend. At first, I tried to make the best of it. Family is important, right? But after a while, the constant visits started to wear me down. The conversations were always the same. "Oh, Richard is such a wonderful son," his mother would say, beaming with pride. "He's the pride of the family." They would go on, praising him for hours while I sat there, forced to smile and nod, but never feeling included in the conversation. Hosting my in-laws every weekend meant I had to cook elaborate meals, clean the house, and entertain them. My weekends, which I once used to relax, became exhausting. I had no time to unwind because I was always playing the perfect daughter-in-law. And no matter how hard I tried, nothing seemed to be good enough. My mother-in-law, Emma, would always have something to criticize. "Isabella, your cooking is a little bland, isn't it?" she'd say, looking over at Richard. "Are you eating properly? You look thinner." Richard never defended me. Instead, he would smile awkwardly and say, "I eat out during the week, Mom. Don't worry." But it was clear from the way his family talked that they didn't appreciate my cooking. They liked their food heavily seasoned, while I preferred something more subtle. To keep the peace, I started adding more salt to my meals, but even then, it was never enough. "Oh, this is a little better," they'd say, but I could tell they still weren't satisfied. I was doing everything I could to make them happy, but it was never enough. And then things got worse. One night, after a long day at work, I came home to find my mother-in-law in my kitchen. It was almost 9 p.m., and there she was, standing at the stove, her hands moving swiftly as she chopped vegetables. "I'm here to teach you how to cook," she said, smiling as if she was doing me a huge favor. I was exhausted and just wanted to go to bed, but instead, I found myself standing in the kitchen, watching as she made a meal that was far too heavy and over-seasoned for my taste. This wasn't a one-time thing either. Emma started coming over more frequently, always with the excuse of helping me cook. She'd show up on weeknights, despite knowing I had to wake up early for work the next day. It felt like I had no control over my own home anymore. One weekend, after another long visit from my in-laws, I suggested to Richard that we take a trip together, just the two of us. I thought it would be a great way for us to reconnect and spend some time away from his parents. Richard loved the idea and eagerly started planning. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. But that hope quickly turned to despair. On the day of the trip, we arrived at the bus station, bags packed, ready for a weekend getaway. I was excited, thinking it would be just the two of us. But as we waited for the bus, I noticed Richard looking around nervously. "What's wrong?" I asked. But before he could answer, I saw them, his parents. They were walking toward us, waving. "Oh, good. We made it in time," his mother said, out of breath from rushing. "Sorry to keep you waiting, Richard." My heart sank. Richard smiled sheepishly. "Mom and Dad thought it'd be more fun if we all went together," he explained. I was crushed. This trip was supposed to be for us, a chance to get away from the constant presence of his parents. But now they were coming along, and my hopes of a peaceful weekend were gone. The trip was miserable. Richard catered to his parents' every whim, ignoring my preferences. I felt like a third wheel on my own vacation. To make matters worse, The room we were staying in wasn't a cozy suite for two like I had hoped. It was a large, four-person room, with beds for all of us. Their loud snoring kept me up all night, and by the time we returned home, I was more exhausted than when we left. Back at work, a colleague pointed out something that sent a chill down my spine. "Isabella, you've got a bald spot," she said, pointing to the back of my head. I rushed to the bathroom and looked in the mirror, horrified to find a small coin-sized patch where my hair had fallen out. The stress of dealing with Richard's parents had started to take a physical toll on me. That night, I confronted Richard. I told him we needed to do something about the constant visits from his parents. He seemed sympathetic at first, but when I suggested inviting my own parents along for our next trip, he recoiled. "No, that's too tiring. I have to be considerate," he said. Considerate? He expected me to put up with his parents every weekend, but the moment I suggested inviting mine, it was suddenly too much for him to handle. I realized then that Richard would never prioritize me over his parents. I was always going to come second. It was time to take action. I started planning another trip, but this time I had a different plan. I invited my father along, without telling Richard or his parents. My father used to manage a prestigious hotel, and I knew he would support me in standing up to them. When we arrived at the hotel, Richard and his parents were immediately dissatisfied. The food wasn't seasoned heavily enough for their liking, and they didn't hesitate to complain. What they didn't know was that my father was the one who had arranged everything. He had heard every complaint, and he wasn't about to let them get away with it. Just as they were about to launch into another round of criticism, my father walked into the room. "I understand there have been some complaints," my father said calmly, but with authority. Richard and his parents froze. "If you're not satisfied, you're free to leave," he continued. "But know this, if you continue to mistreat my daughter, I will cut ties with you completely." Richard and his parents were stunned. They quickly tried to backtrack, but it was too late. My father had heard enough, and he wasn't going to let them bully me anymore. They left the hotel that night, tails between their legs. When we returned home, Richard tried to pretend like nothing had happened, but I had made up my mind. I wanted a divorce. I consulted a lawyer and filed the papers. When Richard—
Mean stepsis. Made sure I'm not her family, but now wants me to give up my home for her and her kids. So, let me just start this off by saying, this is kind of a long story, but I need to get it off my chest. I'm Lexi, 25, and I've got a stepsister, Brianna, who's 26. We've also got two younger half-siblings. But this is really about me and Brianna. Well, mostly about how she's been a total nightmare since the moment our parents got married. I was 7 when my mom married her dad, and I guess I was supposed to be happy about gaining a new family and all that. But from the very first day, Brianna made it crystal clear she didn't want me around. Like, I honestly don't even know why. She just hated me right off the bat. I tried to be nice, like any 7-year-old would, right? I thought maybe we could be friends, hang out, maybe play together or whatever kids do. But nope, she wasn't having any of it. She would just look at me like I was trash or something. You know that look where someone doesn't even want to acknowledge you exist? Yeah, that was Brianna. It didn't matter what I did, she would always make sure I knew she didn't want me around. At first I thought maybe it was because I was the new kid in the family or something. Maybe she was mad about our parents getting married. But as time went on, it became clear that it wasn't just that. She just genuinely didn't like me. At school, it was even worse. We went to the same elementary school, and she made sure everyone knew we weren't real sisters. She would say things like, "Oh, she's just my stepsister," or "We're not actually related," whenever someone brought it up. And she didn't stop there. She'd go out of her way to embarrass me in front of other kids. I remember one time during recess, she told the other kids that I wasn't part of her family, and that her dad only married my mom because she needed somewhere to live. I was 7. How are you going to be that cruel to a kid who's just trying to figure out how families work? Her dad, my stepdad, saw what was going on and tried to step in a few times. He'd tell her to knock it off, that we're all family now, and she needed to treat me better. For a while, I think it kind of worked. Like, she stopped being as mean in front of him. But the second he wasn't around, she'd go right back to being a complete jerk. It's like she took pleasure in making me feel like I didn't belong. And honestly, as a little kid, I didn't know how to handle that. I was already trying to adjust to this whole new family situation, and having someone actively reject me made it so much harder. I'd go home after school crying some days, telling my mom about how Brianna was treating me, and she'd always say the same thing. She'll come around, just give her time. Spoiler alert, she never came around. Brianna even started trying to get our younger half-siblings involved. Like, she'd tell them I wasn't their real sister, and that they shouldn't listen to me or hang out with me. This was when they were little, so they didn't really understand what was going on. But still, the fact that she would even try to pull them into her little hate campaign against me, that's messed up, right? She was always trying to find new ways to get under my skin. Now, I'm not going to say my whole childhood was horrible because of Brianna. I had good times too, especially with my mom and stepdad. They did their best to make me feel included, and they were supportive whenever I talked about how Brianna was treating me. But there was always that cloud hanging over me, knowing that the one person who should have been my closest ally in all this, my stepsister, wanted nothing to do with me. And when she did want something to do with me, it was just to make me miserable. I think the worst part was when she started spreading rumors about me at school. There was this one time in middle school when Brianna told a bunch of kids that I had stolen something from her, which I hadn't. But kids being kids, they believed her. And suddenly, I was the thief at school. It was humiliating, and she knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't just being mean, she was actively trying to ruin my life. Eventually, it got to the point where my stepdad had to step in big time. Brianna's attitude was so bad that she stopped coming over to our house for a while. He told her straight up that if she couldn't at least pretend to be civil, then she shouldn't bother coming around at all. I don't know if that was the right move, but honestly, it was kind of a relief. At least I didn't have to deal with her constantly being in my face, making me feel like crap. She eventually moved in with her mom full-time when she was around 13 or so. I thought maybe that would be the end of it, like maybe the distance would give her some perspective or something. But nope, it didn't. We still saw each other sometimes. Holidays, birthdays, that sort of thing. And every single time, she made it clear that nothing had changed. She was still just as cruel, just as dismissive, and just as determined to make me feel like an outsider in my own family. By the time we were teenagers, I had pretty much given up on trying to have any sort of relationship with her. I mean, what was the point? I'd spent years trying to be nice, trying to reach out, and she had never once made any effort to meet me halfway. So I just stopped caring. If she wanted to pretend I didn't exist, then fine. I wasn't going to waste any more energy on her. I remember the last time we had any kind of interaction that wasn't straight up hostile. We were 16, and she had just had her first kid. Yeah, she got pregnant at 16 and moved back in with us for a while. You'd think maybe motherhood would change her, soften her or something, right? Nah, she was the same Brianna. If anything, she got worse. She wouldn't let me anywhere near her baby. She told me to never touch her kid, never talk to them, never even look at them. Like I was some kind of monster she needed to protect her child from. It was at that point that I knew for sure. There was never going to be any kind of sisterly bond between us. She made sure of that. And honestly, I was done trying. I had my own life to focus on, and if she wanted to be a bitter, hateful person, that was her choice. But I wasn't going to let her drag me down with her anymore. So yeah, that's where it all started. It's been years since we last saw each other, and honestly, I thought I was done with her. But as it turns out, she wasn't done with me. Alright, so where I left off, I hadn't seen or talked to Brianna in years, and I was honestly cool with that. My life was moving along fine without her drama, and I was doing my own thing. But then, a couple of months ago, I get this phone call from my mom. Now, my mom isn't one to call me for no reason, so I immediately knew something was up. I pick up the phone and she's like, "Hey Lexi, there's something we need to talk about." Right away, I'm thinking, great, what now? My mom has this way of sugarcoating stuff, so I already knew whatever she was about to say was probably bad news. So she starts off all casual, telling me about how Brianna has had a really hard time lately. Apparently, she lost her job a few months ago, and then not long after that, she lost her house. Now she's living with my mom and stepdad along with her 4 kids, and things are, in her words, a bit tense. At this point, I'm still just listening, but I'm not exactly feeling sorry for Brianna. I mean, after everything she's done, how can I? But then, my mom drops the bomb. Brianna's been asking if she and the kids can stay with you for a while. I swear I almost dropped my phone. Like what? Stay with me? The same person who couldn't stand me for years now wants to move into my house with 4 kids? I didn't even know how to respond at first. I just kind of sat there in silence for a minute, trying to process it all. My mom took that as her chance to keep talking, telling me about how cramped their house is and how it would be really helpful if I could take Brianna in for a little bit, just until she gets back on her feet. Now here's the thing. I've worked hard to get where I am. I've got my own place, a job I'm proud of, and a life that's finally drama-free. The last thing I want is to throw Brianna and her chaos into the mix. Plus, 4 kids? That's not a little bit of help. That's a whole new life I didn't sign up for. So I just said, Mom, I don't think that's a good idea. Of course, she tried to talk me into it. Lexi, she's your sister. She's family. Don't you think you should help her out? But honestly, family or not, there's a limit to what I'm willing to deal with. And Brianna passed that limit a long time ago. I told my mom, look, I get that she's in a tough spot, but she's never treated me like family. She made her bed, and now she has to lie in it. My mom didn't exactly like hearing that, but I wasn't about to let her guilt me into something I knew I'd regret. And that's when things really took a turn. The very next day, Brianna called me herself. Now, mind you, I hadn't heard her voice in years, so when I saw her name pop up on my phone, my heart started racing a little bit. I wasn't even sure if I should answer it, but I figured it was better to get it over with. So I picked up, and before I could even say hello, she jumped straight into it. Lexi, I need your help, she said, not even bothering with pleasantries. She sounded desperate, which I guess made sense given the situation, but it still caught me off guard. I mean, this is someone who spent her whole life acting like I didn't exist, and now she's asking me for help like we're suddenly best friends? She went on to explain that she and her kids were crammed into a tiny room at my parents' house, and that it wasn't working out. There was no space, her kids were constantly fighting, and she was at her wits' end. I listened, but all I could think about was how she'd treated me like garbage for years, and now she expected me to swoop in and save her. Then she hit me with the wildest part. She didn't just want to stay with me. She wanted me to move out of my house and move back in with our parents so she and her kids could take over my place. I swear I almost laughed out loud when she said it. Like, is she for real? She basically told me that she needed my house more than I did, and I could help the family by making the sacrifice. I was stunned. I couldn't even form words for a second. When I finally did respond, all I could manage was, wait, you want me to move out of my house for you? I was hoping I misunderstood or something, but nope. She doubled down. Yes, she said, like it was the most normal request in the world. You can go live with Mom and Dad for a while. They have plenty of space. It's just until I get back on my feet. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This woman, who had made my life a living hell, was now trying to kick me out of my own home. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my cool, and said, Brianna, that's not going to happen. I'm not giving up my house. I worked hard for it, and I'm not about to hand it over to you. That's when she lost it. She started yelling, calling me selfish, saying I didn't care about family, that I was leaving her out to dry. She even threw in the fact that I don't have kids, like that somehow made me less deserving of my own home. She was full-on guilt-tripping me, trying to make me feel bad for not helping her out. But here's the thing, I wasn't going to fall for it. Not this time. I'd spent years trying to make peace with her, trying to be the bigger person, and where did it get me? Nowhere. So I just calmly said, Brianna, I'm sorry you're in this situation, but it's not my responsibility to fix it. You've never wanted anything to do with me, and now all of a sudden I'm supposed to uproot my life for you? No. That didn't go over well. She started screaming even louder, telling me I was a horrible person, that I was turning my back on my own family. It was honestly pretty shocking how fast she turned from desperate to angry. I didn't know what else to say, so I just hung up the phone. After that, I didn't hear from her for a while. I figured she had gotten the message, but I was wrong. A few days later, my mom called again, and this time she was really upset. Apparently, Brianna had been complaining to her nonstop about how I was being selfish and unwilling to help. My mom, bless her heart, was still trying to play peacemaker, saying, Can't you just let her stay for a little while? She really needs help, Lexi. But I wasn't budging. I told my mom the same thing I told Brianna. I'm not giving up my house, and I'm not letting her walk all over me. I've had enough of her crap. My mom wasn't happy, but I could tell she was starting to get where I was coming from. Brianna's entitlement was off the charts, and even my mom couldn't deny that. Still, she was stuck in the middle, trying to keep the peace between her two daughters. But I wasn't about to let Brianna use that to manipulate me anymore. Update 1. Alright, so after the whole phone call mess with Brianna, I was feeling pretty good about standing my ground. I figured she'd either find another solution or keep complaining to our parents until they got sick of her. Either way, it was out of my hands, and I could finally get back to living my life. Or so I thought. A couple of weeks later, I was sitting at home on a Saturday, just minding my own business, when there's a knock at my door. Now, I don't really get many visitors, so I was a little confused. I wasn't expecting anyone, and honestly, I kind of hoped it was just some delivery guy with a package or something. But when I opened the door, guess who was standing there? Yep, Brianna. She was standing on my doorstep with all 4 of her kids and a bunch of suitcases. My stomach dropped. Like, seriously? I just stood there for a second, not even knowing what to say. She looked at me with this dead serious expression and said, Lexi, we need to talk. I felt my face get hot. I wasn't mad at first. I was more shocked than anything. What are you doing here? I asked, trying to keep my cool. Her kids were all standing there, looking tired and kind of confused, and I felt bad for them. But I couldn't believe she actually showed up like this. Brianna sighed like she was annoyed with me, which made no sense. Look, Lexi, I've got nowhere else to go. It's too cramped at mom and dad's, and they're getting frustrated with me. I thought you'd have a little more empathy, considering we're family. I could feel my jaw tighten. Empathy. After everything she put me through, she wanted to play the family card now? I was still trying to wrap my head around the fact that she was standing on my porch, clearly expecting me to just let her and her kids move in. I wasn't having it. Brianna, I said, trying my best not to lose my temper. I already told you I'm not letting you stay here. I don't know why you thought showing up unannounced would change anything. She rolled her eyes and crossed her arms. You're being ridiculous. It's not like I'm asking for much. We'll only be here for a little while, just until I can find a new job and a place for the kids. At that point, I could feel the anger bubbling up. You're not staying here, I said, louder this time. I'm sorry you're in a tough spot, but you've never wanted anything to do with me. And now you expect me to just drop everything for you? Her kids were starting to get restless, and I could tell this conversation wasn't going to go anywhere good. Brianna, of course, wasn't giving up that easily. She shifted her weight and said, It's not just about me, Lexi. Think about the kids. They need somewhere stable. Don't you care about them? Okay, let me pause for a second here. Of course I care about the kids. They didn't do anything wrong, and it's not their fault their mom put them in this situation. But that doesn't mean it's my responsibility to fix everything. I had no connection to them, thanks to Brianna making sure I was never part of their lives. So, while I felt for them, I wasn't about to let her guilt me into taking them in. I care, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But you made it clear a long time ago that I wasn't part of their lives. You didn't want me near them? Now all of a sudden I'm supposed to play the hero? She huffed and glared at me. It's not about the past anymore, Lexi. You need to grow up. Things are different now. I'm asking you as a mother, not as your stepsister. I couldn't believe the nerve of her, as if her being a mother erased all the crap she put me through growing up. I took a deep breath, knowing this wasn't going to end well. Brianna, I'm not doing this. You need to leave. Her face twisted into something like a mix of anger and desperation. So that's it? You're just going to turn your back on me? On the kids? After everything we've been through, you're just going to let us suffer? At that point, I was done. I was trying to stay calm for the sake of the kids, but her entitlement was too much. You made your choice a long time ago, I said firmly. You didn't want me in your life then, and I'm not letting you use me now. She glared at me, her eyes narrowed. You're unbelievable. You really think you're better than me, don't you? That hit a nerve. I wasn't trying to act like I was better than her. I just wasn't about to let her walk all over me. But before I could even respond, her oldest kid, who looked like she was around 10 or so, tugged on Brianna's arm and said, Mom, can we go? I'm tired. Brianna glanced down at her, and for a second I thought maybe she'd give up and leave. But nope, she turned back to me and said, You're making a huge mistake, Lexi. Don't think I'm going to forget this. And with that, she stormed off, her kids trailing behind her. I watched as they loaded back into their car, Brianna muttering under her breath the whole time. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or just angry. Probably a mix of both. As they drove off, I shut the door and leaned against it, trying to process what just happened. I mean, I knew Brianna was entitled, but showing up at my house with her kids and expecting me to just roll over like that, it blew my mind. I felt bad for her kids. They didn't deserve any of this. But I wasn't about to let Brianna manipulate me into giving up my home. After she left, I called my mom to let her know what happened. She wasn't surprised, but she did sound disappointed that I didn't help. I understand, Lexi, she said, but Brianna's in a really tough spot right now. Maybe there's another way you can help. But I'd already made up my mind. Mom, I'm not getting involved. I can't. She's never treated me like family, and I'm not about to let her drag me down into her mess. My mom sighed. I just wish things were different. Me too, I said, and I meant it. But some things never change, and Brianna was one of them. Update 2. After Brianna and her kids left, I thought maybe that was the end of it. Like, she'd finally understand that I wasn't going to give in and she'd move on to bothering someone else. But of course, that's not how it worked out. Honestly, I should have known better. It didn't take long before things escalated in a way I wasn't expecting. A few days after her dramatic visit, I got another call from my mom. Now, this wasn't unusual. She and I talked fairly often, but the second I answered, I could tell something was up. Her voice was tight, like she was stressed or trying not to yell, which immediately put me on edge. Lexi, I need to talk to you about what happened with Brianna. she said, jumping straight into it. I sighed. Mom, I already told you what happened. She showed up at my house and I told her she couldn't stay here. Yeah, well, she's been talking to your stepdad and me nonstop since then, saying how unfair you're being. She's claiming you're turning your back on family and she hesitated. And she's saying we should be cutting you off for not helping her. I was stunned for a second. Like, Brianna was really out here trying to turn my own mom and stepdad against me because I wouldn't let her take over my house? The audacity. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Wait, she's telling you guys to cut me off? Pretty much, Mom replied. She's making it sound like you're heartless for not helping her and the kids when they need it. She's really got your stepdad all worked up. He's been talking about how we should be doing more to support her as a family. I couldn't believe it. Mom, you know that's ridiculous, right? She's trying to manipulate you because I won't give her what she wants. Mom sighed, and I could hear the exhaustion in her voice. I know, Lexi. I get it. But things are getting tense here. Your stepdad feels like we should be supporting her more, especially with the kids involved. And Brianna, well, you know how she is. She's making us feel like we're failing her as parents. I rubbed my temples, feeling a headache coming on. This was exactly what I was afraid of. Brianna pulling everyone into her drama and making me the villain for not bending to her demands. Mom, listen, I get that she's in a bad spot, but that doesn't mean I'm responsible for fixing her problems. I've been more than clear about why I can't help her. I know, Mom said softly, but you need to understand that your stepdad is struggling with this. He doesn't like seeing his daughter in such a rough place, and he feels like we should be doing more to make sure the kids are okay. And there it was, the guilt trip. It wasn't even Mom doing it on purpose, but hearing her talk about the kids like that made me feel like I was the bad guy. But I wasn't. I knew that. Brianna was using her kids as pawns in her little game, and I wasn't about to let myself get played. Mom, I'm not going to let Brianna guilt me into anything. I understand that the kids are in a tough spot, but that's on her, not me. She's the one who's made her choices, and now she has to deal with the consequences. Mom was quiet for a moment, and I could tell she was trying to figure out what to say next. Finally, she spoke. Lexi, I wish things weren't like this. I hate seeing the family so divided. Me too, I said, my voice softer now. But this isn't on me, Mom. Brianna has been treating me like I don't exist for years, and now all of a sudden she wants my help? That's not how family works. There was another pause, and then she sighed. I know, you're right. But just be prepared, Lexi. Your stepdad is really upset, and I'm worried he's going to take Brianna's side in all of this. That hit me harder than I expected. I'd always had a decent relationship with my stepdad, and the thought of him turning on me because of Brianna's manipulations made me feel sick. But I couldn't back down now. I had to stand my ground no matter how messy things got. Thanks for the heads up, Mom, I said quietly, but I'm not going to change my mind. I know, she replied. Just be careful, okay? I don't want this to get any worse. After we hung up, I couldn't help but feel this knot in my stomach. It was like no matter what I did, Brianna was determined to drag me into her mess. And now she was turning my stepdad against me too? It was exhausting, and honestly, I wasn't sure how much more of this I could take. But of course, Brianna wasn't done. A few days later, I started getting calls from other family members, people I hadn't talked to in months. My aunt, my cousin, even some distant relatives on my stepdad's side. Every single one of them had the same story. Brianna had been going around telling them how I'd refused to help her when she was desperate and homeless, painting me as the villain in her little sob story. It was infuriating. I knew she was manipulative, but this was a new low, even for her. I spent half my time fielding calls from concerned relatives, all of them trying to guilt me into doing the right thing by helping her out. I couldn't believe how easily she'd managed to get them on her side, even though none of them knew the full story. At one point, my cousin, who I hadn't spoken to in over a year, called me up and started lecturing me about family values and how I was letting my pride get in the way of helping someone in need. I was so close to losing it, but I managed to keep my cool long enough to explain my side of the story. Look, I told her, you don't know the half of it. Brianna's been treating me like dirt since we were kids. Now she wants me to give up my home for her? That's not happening. My cousin tried to argue, saying that people change and that Brianna was just trying to survive, but I wasn't having it. She hasn't changed at all, I said, my voice firm. She's just using this situation to get what she wants. I'm not falling for it. By the time we hung up, I was exhausted. I couldn't believe how much energy Brianna was draining from me, even when she wasn't physically in my life. It was like she'd found a way to invade my space without even being there. As the days went on, The calls finally started to die down, but the tension with my mom and stepdad was still there. Every conversation felt like it was walking on eggshells, and I could tell they were struggling to balance their loyalty to me with their guilt over Brianna. It was a mess, and I hated that it had come to this. But no matter how much pressure they put on me, I wasn't going to give in. Brianna had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. And if that meant I had to be the bad guy in her story, so be it. Update 3. So, after all the chaos of Brianna trying to weasel her way into my life and my house, you'd think things might finally calm down, right? Wrong. Because, of course, Brianna had one more trick up her sleeve. This time, though, it wasn't just phone calls or guilt trips from relatives. It was something way worse. It started with a knock on the door. Now, after everything that had happened, I was a little paranoid about people just showing up at my place unannounced, so I wasn't exactly thrilled to hear knocking. I checked the peephole, and there was a man standing there in a uniform. My heart sank because I immediately thought something bad had happened. I opened the door, and he handed me an envelope and said, "You've been served." I stared at the envelope, confused and a little freaked out. I hadn't done anything wrong, so what was this about? I opened it right there, and to my absolute shock, I was looking at some kind of legal paperwork. It took me a second to process it, but when I finally understood what I was reading, I couldn't believe it. Brianna was suing me. For what? To force me to let her and her kids stay in my house. I'm not kidding. She had actually gone and filed some kind of claim that I was denying her housing or some nonsense, trying to legally force me to give up my home for her and her kids. I could barely even comprehend it. I mean, who does that? She couldn't guilt me into it, so now she was trying to legally take my home? I felt this wave of anger and disbelief wash over me. I didn't even know you could do something like that. I called my mom immediately and told her what happened. She was just as shocked as I was. "That can't be real," she said. "There's no way she can do that." But it was real. I double-checked the paperwork, and sure enough, Brianna had actually gone to a lawyer to try and pull this off. I was in total disbelief. I called a lawyer myself to figure out what my options were, and thankfully, he reassured me that this whole thing was ridiculous, and there was no way it would hold up in court. Still, the fact that Brianna had even tried something like this was insane. The lawyer told me not to worry too much, but we'd still have to deal with it legally, so we started prepping. I couldn't believe it had come to this. I mean, it's one thing to have a toxic family member who tries to take advantage of you, but to actually sue your own stepsister because she won't give you her house? That's a whole new level of entitlement. A few weeks later, we had the court date set, and I was feeling pretty nervous. I knew I had the law on my side, but I also knew how manipulative Brianna could be. I was worried she'd try to spin the situation to make me look like the bad guy again, like she'd been doing with our family. But there was no turning back now. We had to go through with it. When the day finally came, I walked into that courtroom feeling a mix of anxiety and anger. Brianna was already there with her lawyer, and when I saw her, I swear she didn't even look worried. If anything, she looked smug, like she actually thought she was going to win. I sat down with my lawyer, and we started going over everything. The judge called us up, and Brianna's lawyer started making this whole case about how she was a struggling mother of 4, and I had refused to provide housing for her in her time of need. The way they talked, you'd think I was some kind of heartless monster who kicked her and her kids out onto the street. I couldn't believe the lengths she was going to make me look bad. She didn't mention, of course, how she'd been horrible to me for years, or how she'd tried to manipulate me into giving up my house. It was all about how she was a single mom, just trying to provide for her kids, and how I was the selfish stepsister standing in her way. When it was our turn, my lawyer laid everything out. He explained how Brianna had never wanted anything to do with me until she needed something, how she had shown up at my house unannounced, demanding that I move out so she could move in, and how she'd been trying to guilt me into helping her, even though we had no real relationship. The judge listened carefully, and I could see him nodding along, understanding where I was coming from. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. The judge turned to Brianna and asked her point blank, "Why do you believe you are entitled to your stepsister's home?" And that's when it all fell apart for her. She stuttered and tried to make it about the kids again, but the judge wasn't having it. He cut her off and basically told her that this was a ridiculous claim. He explained that I had no legal obligation to let her stay in my house, and that just because she was in a tough situation didn't mean she could take advantage of family. Hearing the judge say that out loud was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. Brianna looked like she'd been slapped in the face. Her smug attitude completely disappeared, and she just stood there, speechless. I could see the realization hit her. She wasn't going to get what she wanted this time. The judge dismissed the case, and that was it. I walked out of that courtroom with a huge weight lifted off my shoulders. Brianna didn't even look at me as we left. She just grabbed her stuff and stormed out with her lawyer. I wasn't sure what would happen after that, but I knew one thing. I was finally done with her. When I got home, I called my mom to tell her what happened. She was relieved, but also sad. I could tell she was still struggling with the whole situation, and I felt bad for her. But at the same time, I couldn't keep letting Brianna ruin my life. Enough was enough. Since then, Brianna hasn't tried to contact me. I haven't heard a word from her, and honestly, I'm okay with that. I've got my life back, and for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm in control again. So yeah, that's the story of how my stepsister tried to take my house and ended up losing everything. It's not exactly the happy ending I wanted, but at least now I know where I stand. And honestly, I'm just glad it's over.
Welcome to Real Life Stories New, where we bring you compelling tales that inspire, challenge, and push boundaries. Today's story begins with Naomi, a driven entrepreneur whose life had been built on perseverance and grit. Boarding a first-class flight to celebrate years of hard work and success, she expected a luxurious journey, a well-earned reward. But what unfolded was a shocking act of prejudice and cruelty that would not only test her strength but ignite a movement for change. From the moment Naomi stepped into the airport, her confidence was palpable. Her tailored blazer, flawless demeanor, and sharp gaze reflected her success. This was her time to bask in the fruits of her labor. But behind the glitz of first class lurked a harsh reality, whispers, stares, and subtle slights reminding her that, for some, no achievement could override their bias. What began as subtle dismissals escalated into humiliation of the worst kind, a public act of degradation at the hands of someone who believed they held power over her. But instead of breaking, Naomi did something extraordinary. She stood tall, channeling the pain and outrage into a fearless fight for justice, not just for herself but for countless others who've been silenced by discrimination. This is not just a story of adversity. It's a testament to resilience and the power of one voice to spark change. Stay with us as we unravel Naomi's journey from humiliation to empowerment, a journey that challenged an industry and inspired a global movement. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Together, let's amplify stories that matter and create a world where respect and equality are non-negotiable. As Naomi stepped onto the plane, her head held high, she felt a quiet pride. This flight wasn't just a journey, it was a milestone, a celebration of years of sacrifice, sleepless nights, and unwavering determination. The first-class cabin, with its plush seats and refined ambience, was exactly what she deserved. She settled into her window seat, ready to immerse herself in the tranquility of the sky. But the warmth of this moment quickly faded. The flight attendant, Michael, approached with a service smile that vanished the moment his eyes landed on her. His words were polite, but his tone was cold, distant. The difference in how he interacted with her compared to the other passengers was glaring. While others received champagne with laughter and care, her glass of water was delivered with an indifferent thud. Naomi kept her composure, but the whispers began almost immediately. Across the aisle, a well-dressed woman clutched her designer handbag tighter, her lips curving into a subtle smirk. "Times have changed," she murmured to her companion, her words meant to reach Naomi. "First class isn't what it used to be." Her companion chuckled softly. "Anyone can get in these days," he said. The weight of their judgment bore down on Naomi, but she refused to let it show. Instead, she gazed out the window, focusing on the horizon and reminding herself of the resilience that had carried her this far. Yet the microaggressions became impossible to ignore. A hastily arranged plate of snacks was dropped on her tray, noticeably less elegant than what others had been served. The whispers grew louder, crueler, each one chipping away at her moment of peace. Then Michael returned, and this time his actions went beyond mere indifference. "We have standards here," he said with a condescending edge, producing a pair of clippers from his pocket. The cabin fell silent as he turned them on with a deliberate hum. Naomi froze in disbelief. The passengers watched with a mix of morbid curiosity and amusement as Michael leaned in, his intent clear. "Don't you dare," Naomi said, her voice sharp with warning. But her words were ignored. With cold efficiency, Michael ran the clippers through Naomi's hair, the uneven braids falling into her lap and onto the pristine cabin floor. Gasps rippled through the cabin, but no one stepped in to stop him. Instead, some passengers laughed softly, their smirks widening. Naomi sat frozen, her chest tight with humiliation and anger. Ellen, the woman across the aisle, leaned toward her companion again, her voice dripping with disdain. "Well, that's one way to keep the class in first class." Naomi's hands clenched into fists. She wanted to scream, to demand that someone, anyone, acknowledge the cruelty unfolding in front of them. But instead of breaking, she did something extraordinary. She stood abruptly, her chair snapping back with a loud clatter. "Enough," she shouted, her voice cutting through the oppressive silence. All eyes turned to her. Naomi's gaze swept the cabin, her voice steady despite the tremble in her hands. "This isn't just about me," she said. "This is about every person who's been made to feel small, unwelcome, or unworthy. You think this is acceptable? To humiliate someone simply because they don't fit your idea of who belongs here?" Michael faltered under her glare. The smirks disappeared, replaced by unease. But Naomi wasn't done. She pulled out her phone and began taking pictures, Michael with the clippers in hand, the hair scattered on the floor, and the faces of the passengers who had laughed. Each snapshot was a piece of evidence, a silent promise that this would not end here. "What are you doing?" Michael asked, his tone sharp with panic. "Documenting," Naomi replied coldly. "You've left me no choice." The whispers in the cabin shifted, now filled with discomfort and uncertainty. Michael retreated, his confidence crumbling, but Naomi stood her ground. She remained composed, refusing to let the humiliation define her. As the plane touched down, Naomi was the first to rise. She turned to Michael one last time. "I'll be speaking to your supervisor," she said calmly. "And trust me, this isn't over." The passengers watched in stunned silence as she walked down the aisle, her head held high despite the uneven patches in her hair. Outside, the cool night air hit her face, grounding her in the reality of what had just happened. But instead of breaking her, it fueled her resolve. Naomi contacted her lawyer before she even left the terminal, recounting every detail of the flight. She attached the photos she had taken and demanded accountability, not just for herself, but for anyone who had ever been subjected to such injustice. The airline's response was swift but insufficient. A public apology arrived, laden with promises of investigations and training programs. But Naomi wasn't satisfied with empty words. She demanded systemic change, policies to protect passengers, mandatory diversity training, and real consequences for those who perpetuated prejudice. Her story went viral, sparking a global conversation about discrimination in elite spaces. Strangers from all walks of life reached out, sharing their own experiences of exclusion and bias. Naomi's courage became a rallying cry, a beacon for those who had been silenced for too long. With each message of support, Naomi's determination grew. She knew this wasn't just her fight, it was a battle for everyone who had ever been made to feel they didn't belong. She turned her pain into purpose, founding an organization dedicated to fighting systemic discrimination and creating spaces where everyone was treated with dignity and respect. What happened to Naomi on that flight was more than an act of cruelty, it was a catalyst for change. And as her story continued to spread, it became clear that her voice was just the beginning of a movement too powerful to ignore. This is the fight Naomi chose to lead, and it's far from over. As the weeks passed, Naomi's courage became a symbol of resilience and a rallying cry for justice. Her story wasn't just about one moment of humiliation, it became a movement. The airline was forced to implement real changes, including firing Michael, retraining staff, and creating a new passenger bill of rights to ensure respect and equality for all. But Naomi's fight didn't stop there. She channeled her experience into founding Equal Horizons, an organization that combats systemic discrimination in travel and beyond. Through her work, she empowered others to share their stories, fight for accountability, and demand better from industries that had failed them. Her voice, once silenced by prejudice, now amplified the voices of countless others. Naomi's bravery reminded the world that no matter how high the walls of exclusion may seem, they can crumble when met with unyielding resolve. This is more than a story of survival, it's a testament to the power of standing tall against injustice. It's a reminder that every voice matters, and together, we can create a world where dignity and respect are not privileges but rights. If Naomi's journey moved you, let us know in the comments below. Share this video to spread her message, and don't forget to like and subscribe to Real Life Stories New. Let's hit 1,000 subscribers together and continue to amplify stories that inspire change. Thank you for being part of this journey, your support makes a difference.